I am a fan of paranormal books. If you've been around the channel at all, you will see that here and there I read paranormal books, whether they're about ghosts or cryptids or just weird unexplained phenomena. So today we are going to talk about a book called A Life with Ghosts by Steve Gonsalves. Steve Gonsalves is one of the OGs from Ghost Hunters, which I think started back in the early 2000s. I'm not sure the exact year, but it was him, Grant Wilson, and Jason Hawes, and then Dave Tango. And there was other people on the show too, Dustin Perry and the Taps people and all of that. But anyways, we're gonna talk about his book today. And the book basically goes over his career of how he got into being fascinated with the subject of ghosts and the afterlife, things that are scary, what led him on the road to the path where he became a paranormal investigator. And he shares some of the different investigations that he had done at some very interesting places. The variety that he talks about in the book's pretty cool. You have everything from, your classic insane asylum to zoos and the Sloss furnaces and just all these other places. And then also they investigated the house that was the purported guy who was possibly the Black Dahlia murderer. They investigated that house too, which is really super weird and creepy. It's out in LA. And just his experience in the field overall. And it was quite a fascinating book. I really enjoyed it. I read it in like 2 days. So he talks about like how he got into the paranormal, and it kind of stemmed from just, watching scary movies growing up, like movies that had to do with ghosts, Ghostbusters, Poltergeist. Another one was called The Entity. So that kind of like sparked his interest. And his parents were super encouraging. Apparently they let him hang out in graveyards and abandoned buildings by himself when he was younger to do paranormal investigating. I don't know that my parents would be as cool about that because, you never know who's out there. It's scary. Also, I find it fascinating to find out that kind of like what he did before becoming, I guess full-time ghost hunter or full-time paranormal investigator. He worked in the jewelry business with his dad as a diamond setter. He was a police officer. He also was a drummer in a band and always had this fascination with ghosts and the afterlife, and also loves horror as well. When he was younger, he would occasionally go to these lectures that Ed and Lorraine Warren would put on. If you don't know who Ed and Lorraine Warren are, they are very famous paranormal investigators from back in the day. If you've seen any of the Conjuring movies, they fictionally portray them in that, and they kind of brought a light of interest to the subject matter. I mean, it goes further back that people were interested in these subject matters, but for the coming up generations and for the paranormal coming more into mainstream as it is now, like before you were like a super weirdo, people were like, oh, that you believe in ghosts and aliens and you're a crazy person. But now it's a little more accepted. There's so many shows on TV, like all the paranormal shows and whatnot. He would go to some of these lectures. And there was one that he went to. They were gonna go and investigate this like cemetery or whatever. And he had talked to them a little bit, and then he ended up being able to go with them. Him and maybe a few other people. I'm not really sure who else went, but I know that he went with them and they were investigating this graveyard. He kind of got to know them and talked a little bit about the stuff he was doing with his own like paranormal investigations. And I guess he got their phone number and they were like, if you ever have any questions or something, give us a call. And he didn't for a while, but then he came across a case that he was like, he wasn't really sure what to do, and so he reached out to them. When he first called, he got their nephew, who called him back, John Zaffis, talked to him, and then eventually Ed called him back, and then they worked on this case together. And I thought that was really cool because I had no idea that he had ever met them. So you get kind of like how he got into it, and then from having his own paranormal group, he would bounce around and go to different events and whatnot. And I don't remember how he met him, but he met Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson at some point. And then these three together ended up being on the show Ghost Hunters, and it just kind of went from his sparked interest from when he was younger, and his parents were like, hey, you're young enough, do it. You can always do something else later in life. He went full-fledged into it, and this has been his career and what he's done, and it's really fascinating. And the investigations, what I really liked, he sections them off into each place that he went, In the beginning of them all, you get all the history of the place and like some of the stories, and I thought that was really cool. Like, I love hearing all about that. It wasn't just this happened, we did this, the blah 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 blah, but you have the history of it, and that makes it even more interesting. So then you're more invested to hear like what happens and what his experiences are at each place, which is awesome. Unless you experience it yourself, one can never really truly be convinced. And I think one thing too that he said that was important was it's in everyone's best interest to investigate and to gather evidence and not to just blindly believe. You have to like do your own research, because so many of these places that he would go to, you have all these local legends and these stories about these different ghosts and whatnot. And then they would get into it and like dig into it and research and go into the records, and then they wouldn't even find anyone with this name that had ever lived there or this, that, and the other. So there was no actual proof of these things. But then you have the cases where there is actual record of people with those names and that this situation happened, or like a newspaper article. So it's always best do the legwork. It's going to help everything overall, and just if you are into the paranormal, make you a better researcher overall. You can't just like go on hearsay. That's just lazy, let's be honest. Dig in and research and just not blindly believe. And you can apply that overall in life. Don't just blindly believe something because someone says it. Look it up. Read books. There's so much to learn. So he talks about so many different places in this book. I think one of the coolest ones was the last place in the book that they go to investigate. They go there with the crew. They get nothing. But him and Dave Tango decide like they're gonna come back and do a little bit more. They're gonna set up some cameras and do some investigation. And they have like a full on like The Shining experience, but they didn't have the cameras set up where all the stuff was happening. Like they were in this other part of the building, Bucksteep Manor, I believe it's called. All of a sudden they hear like silverware and glasses and then tinkling, and it's like it sounds like in the banquet room something's happening in there. So they start, him and Tango start walking towards there, and then it just sounds like a full-on fledged party is happening. There's people talking and all this stuff, and they're like, what the F? You know, usually most of the time his experience was, you know, when you start walking towards us or you get near the source, it just stops. But when they get there, it doesn't stop. It just, the voices are talking, just like parties happening in this banquet room, and it's super weird and super freaky. And then Steve sees that there's a light left on in the kitchen, and they had been given the keys by the guy who owned the place, and he's like, hey, make sure you lock up, turn off all the lights when you're done, da 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 da, I'm not gonna be here for a couple weeks. So he's like, okay, we gotta go turn off the kitchen light. So they're kind of freaked out because this is happening. And so they walk through this like party. I mean, obviously there's nothing there around them, but the sounds are still happening this whole time. So they walk through it, still continues on, and they go to the kitchen, and then all the pots and pans start shaking and like flipping out. They turn off the lights, Tango locks the door, and they kind of like freak out and like get the F out of there. And once they get out of both of those rooms, the sounds all stop. I thought that was so flippin' cool, but you're taking him at his word. And unfortunately that place you can't investigate right now because it is condemned as far as I know, and I don't know if that's gonna come back to be saved or restored, that building and whatnot. But I thought that was kind of a crazy, awesome story. And then he gets into so many more things, like so many weird things that he did. One thing that I was like, I would be so claustrophobic and never, ever in my life would I ever want to do this. Like, I'd go and do some paranormal investigating, but I forget which sanatorium it was at. It was one of the insane asylums. He got in one of the body lockers, like a morgue locker, and had Tango shut him in there, and he was gonna like do some EVP stuff. And I was like, my brain is like in the dark. I would be so claustrophobic and freaking out and losing my effing mind. And when he wants to like come back out, because at first he said to keep him in there for an hour, but after a while he was like, okay, and he knocks on the door, and then like Tango is trying to get him out of there, and then at first the door won't open, and then he's like, oh god, and he tries to sit up and he like bumps his head and trying not to like, you know, freak out, but then you know, he gets the door open and he lets him out. But that would freak me out. I could never do that. And there's just a lot of his different experiences, like investigating with Meatloaf and just all these opportunities and amazing places that he has and that he's gone to. And what I also think is cool too, in his writing, like he talks about every time he comes up to one of these places, he has what seems like this just almost childlike wonder of this building, this history, and like how immense it is. And just, I thought that was really cool too. Like, let's not lose that. We all need to have some more of that like childlike wonder, whether it's just in life in general, or when you go to a historical place, or just being outside in nature. Let's not lose a childlike wonder. It just makes the world a better place to experience, you know, with so much crap going on. We need that. So if you like the paranormal and if you know who Steve Gonsalves is, definitely read this book. It's freaking awesome. I had a great time with it. I liked getting to know a bit more about him. I've seen him at a few paranormal conventions that I went to. He always seems super chill and pretty cool. Somewhere I have a picture with him in Tango. If you were a fan of ghost hunters, or just if you like paranormal stuff in general, this book was fun, fascinating. You get the history of some of these really old, weird places. It was a good time. If you are a fan of paranormal books, the next video coming up will be about another paranormal book, so stick around, check it out. And if you had fun hanging out today, hit that subscribe button, come back, see me again, and we'll talk about more bookish things and weird stuff.